when I was chairman of this commission that Ron mentioned, it turned out we got no money. There's a long story connected to that, but a lot of things I was hoping to do, we didn't do, but I persuaded the commissioners that if a Stanford student didn't know it, the American public probably didn't know it. So then I could poll Stanford students and you'd say, yeah, America's ignorant, America needs to know more, da 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 da. And I've been doing that ever since. As I say, focusing on freshmen to ask, did you learn anything about sleep in high school? And I did it very thoroughly up until 2004, so that's 3 years ago, and never got above 6% of the Stanford freshmen had any systematic teaching about sleep. You know, and I would like to think that Stanford freshmen are probably mostly gone to the best high schools, and if they're going to have this exposure, they, above all, would have it. The Division of Sleep Medicine is only 2 years old, I might add. I was, my student, Chuck Seisler, who is now chief of the Division of Sleep Medicine at Harvard, did it first, and it kind of inspired me to knock on the dean's door at Stanford quite a few times. It is in the Department of Psychiatry, and I don't know how many programs have been institutionalized in this way around the country. I only know of 3. There are probably more, but not many. There are 126 medical schools and 4,000 colleges and universities. And the synopsis is that I first convince you that America and the world is pretty ignorant about sleep-related matters, and that very little is being done about it, and that this ignorance is very serious in many respects, and that really it is time to do something about it. You know, and I think it's very, very gratifying that here at the University of Michigan there is a course for undergraduates, because I think that should be the #1 target, because a professor can teach anything he or she wants as long as it isn't a required course. You know, and if you do a reasonable job, and in this area, it's very relevant to the lives of the students. And the word of mouth is the #1 way that students take my course on sleep and dreams. I did a poll on that. I spent $2,000 to have a half-page ad in the Stanford Daily, and it turned out that only 3% of the class had seen the ad, and it's something like 65% it's word of mouth, and then a few other things, a professor mentions it or something like that. But I think that colleges and universities should be the primary target, and the course that I teach, I'm making available to anybody who wants it. There are 26 lectures and a textbook, and it's easy to teach, and it is by far the largest course at Stanford University, and it's that way because it's fun and it's relevant and the exams are easy. I mean, there's no point in it. What's the point of a difficult exam? I mean, we want students to have the fundamental basic knowledge that'll save their lives, that'll improve their lives, that they can sort of deal with the rest of their lives, and they don't need to know that the frequency of sleep spindles is 12 to 14 cycles a second. When are you going to do that? I could say how many people in this audience knew that. This is a way not to educate the public, but I showed this in my other lecture because it was so amazing. I uncapped the bottle of Elliott's amazing soda. The bottle cap fell onto the table, and there was a quote on the underside: "Dreaming permits each and every one of us to be quietly and safely insane every night of our lives." So I can't believe that sold even one bottle of. And this is a famous historical item. The University of Chicago, under the leadership of Alan Reckshaven, he was the head of the sleep program there, and Stanford had a football game, I think it was in in Santa Fe in 1970. Anyway, we won, and I was always bragging about it. That's the game ball. We won 6-0. And the last time I bragged about it, Jerry Vogel said, "Well, that's not statistically significant." So, the sort of key discoveries in what we would call the modern era of maybe sleep medicine is the observation of rapid eye movements during sleep, 1952, biological rhythms endogenous in I think it was the early 70s when the suprachiasmatic nucleus was lesioned, and also animals in constant conditions proved that. The description of an honest-to-God abnormality, sleep abnormality in narcolepsy, and that was in 1959. That was sleep onset REM periods. I mean, so that is not the way normal adults go to sleep. I wouldn't say that there's so many reports now of people discovering sleep apnea in the Bible and on Noah's Ark and God knows what, but the first really understandable reports were in Europe in 1965, and the actual location of the biological clock was reported in 1972 in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And I like to think that the study of sleepiness and also education started when I was a resident fellow in a Wilbur Hall dormitory at Stanford University. It was called Cedro House. And the students, the tear gas, the police, the troops, the riots were still going on. And in order to keep the students in the dormitory and safe, they were all freshmen, I gave a course on sleep. I didn't know a whole lot, but so after a while, the word got around, it's kind of an interesting course, and students from other dormitories started crashing it, and my students felt it was special for them, and a couple of fistfights occurred. And I finally said, no, look, I will give a course for the entire university in winter quarter, that would be winter quarter 1971, if you don't come now. And I did that, and about 600 students signed up, and there were no classrooms were available that would hold that many students. And I said that in the earlier election, I was a pretty good friend of the dean of the Memorial Church, and I said, could I give my class in the church? And he said, yeah, that's okay. So I did. That I did it from the pulpit in the first class and felt so uncomfortable up there that I never did it again. And I was in the church we had a very famous football coach, Bill Walsh, for his memorial service, and I was kind of distracted by the pulpit, and I thought, I'll wait till everybody leaves and I'll go up and stand there and see how it feels. But it never emptied, so I didn't do it. But that's something I am going to do. I don't know why what is it about a pulpit that, for heaven's sake? I mean, this is a pulpit, in a way. Anyway, here's some sleep medicine landmarks. The formal opening of Stanford University Sleep Clinic, that was July 1970. We had a press conference, one reporter came, and for quite some time, we strove to get at least 5 referrals a week, and it didn't really start picking up until we were 2 or 3 years into it. But grants, trust me, were easier to get in those days, so we could support everything on grant funds until we really got an adequate number of patient referrals. I think the Rimini Symposium in Italy, hosted by Elio Lugaresi, was a landmark, and it was the first kind of really comprehensive description of hypersomnia with periodic breathing, which we also know as obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. We actually founded the Association of Sleep Disorders Clinics in 1975. There were 5 places that were dealing with sleep disorders. The first issue of the Scientific Journal of Sleep was in 1978, and I won't go into a long story, but I don't remember who suggested just call it sleep, but that was, in my opinion, the right thing to do. The first diagnostic classification of sleep disorders was in 1979, and from primary, secondary, sleep-related, et cetera, there were 88 specific diagnoses. The European Sleep Research Society, does anybody know? You should know, Ricardo. When it started, okay. I couldn't find that. Is there? we started doing multiple sleep latency tests, which is every 2 hours, you record how long it takes a person to fall asleep, and you do it at 10, 12, 2 p.m., 4 p.m., 6 p.m., and the sleep latency, and the test is stopped at 20 minutes if the patient or subject doesn't fall asleep. And those 5 sleep latencies give you a very good measure of the underlying sleep tendency. So as we started doing this on Stanford students, their mean score was usually under 5 minutes. And for a short time, I thought they all had narcolepsy. Why would Stanford recruit narcoleptics? But I realized they're all sleep deprived to a really quite severe degree. And of course, didn't realize this, that they were. The first meeting was now the American Academy of Sleep Medicine that combined the Sleep Research Society, the Association of Polysomnographic Technologists, and the American Academy was in 1980. As it was back then, it was amalgamated, but now these associations are separate, although they are all participate in the annual meeting of the Associated Professional Sleep Societies. Terry Young at the University of Wisconsin did the first population prevalence study and described her results as 24% of adult males and 9% of adult females have obstructive sleep apnea. The prevalence probably is higher in the elderly, and she did not include people under the age of 18, but her figures factor out to 30 million Americans, which makes obstructive sleep apnea the #1 illness in terms of chronic illness prevalence. And the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research in the National Institutes of Health was legislated into existence in 1993, legislation written by Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon. And at some point, the American Academy, then the Association of Sleep Disorders Centers, developed an examination so we could document the expertise of practitioners. And this is the first diploma. I signed my own diploma. And there's Merrill Mittler and Tom Roth. I'm sure most of you know Tom Roth. I didn't see anything, as I told the audience this morning, I didn't see anything wrong with that. I mean, there's got to be a first time for everything. And but people would sort of grizzle about that. It doesn't look good. And I took the exam again 5 years later, and it was hard. And I got very anxious. I mean, God, what if I don't pass? You know what? So I wouldn't take it again to save my soul. No, and there's some movement that you should do this every 5 years. I'm just hoping that doesn't happen. Our first case series with the members of the then ASDC is here, and we were beginning to realize that insomnia was not, at least in the sleep clinics of the day, going to be this huge problem that everybody expected. You know, it used to be the doctors, every patient gets a sleeping pill, and everybody has insomnia, and blah, blah, blah. The case series didn't support that, and you know, the #1 reason to test sleep was the suspicion that the patient had obstructive sleep apnea. Very few clinics did all-night polysomnograms for patients who complained of insomnia. And the leading complaint was not, people didn't come and say, I have excessive daytime sleepiness. You know, they would just say, I'm tired all the time. You know, and we realized very soon that was excessive sleepiness, but that wasn't the complaint. So when people say, it always bothers me a little, they say, I'm tired all the time, and you know, well, if I try to watch television, I fall asleep, or my wife wakes me up. And a few times we would find sleep apnea with no symptoms. And that's pretty much the way it is today. I told this story this morning. Is there anyone in this audience that was there this morning? Just a few, thank God. Okay. No, I had an experience in 2003 that I announced that I was going to give my course, Sleep and Dreams, for the last time. And I had been assigned a room that had about 650 seats, and 1,200 students signed up. So I said, well, I'll give it twice. I'll give a lecture, and then I'll give the same lecture right after it, and then this way we could. That is about the worst experience I ever had, to do it and then do it exactly the same way again, which is what I'm kind of a little uncomfortable about right now. But anyway, I was able to get the largest auditorium on the campus, Memorial Hall, which holds 1,500, and only gave one lecture for the course that year. And there, I have to tell a story because I don't think it's in this lecture, is that I told the class that since this was the last time I was going to do this, that, what's the point of an exam? But what we'll do is, instead of having something in finals week, the last class session, I'll give a 10-minute super easy exam. I just want you to know sleep debt. There are two kinds of sleep. Just simple facts, be a simple exam. And then we prepared an incredibly difficult exam. And so the first exam question comes up on the screen, and there's kind of a shocked silence. And then there started to be moaning and groaning. And then the second question comes up. It's even harder. It's just super hard. And they didn't have time to answer the first one. Now the moaning and groaning is just really audible. As they say, if we really did this, I would have been lynched. But then the next slide comes up. In honor of the last class, the final exam is canceled. And fortunately, I had two video cameras going. The bedlam and the cheering, it was incredible. So whenever I'm depressed, I look at that. Anyway, I did something for the American Medical Association in 1969, and what I thought would be really exciting was to show a movie of the sleep stages that is coming out of the polysomnograph and the pen and ink. So you had the sleep stages on this paper, and I just took a movie of the paper coming out of the polysomnogram. And I thought, you could see sleep spindles, you could see slow waves, see rapid eye movements, you could see the muscle tone go down. God, is that exciting? And so when I was doing this, I had 8 of these in the morning, evening, 4 days. It was in New York. Just about everybody fell asleep during that movie. And I thought, well, it's early in the day. They've been traveling. And it happened again in the afternoon. It happened the next morning. I mean, it was a narcissistic injury of major proportions. But I realized that probably was a little soporific, especially if you'd never done it. It wasn't that meaningful. So I didn't show it anymore. But I was quite impressed that nearly everyone fell asleep. It wasn't that boring. And boredom doesn't cause sleep anyway. So that triggered a serious interest in daytime sleepiness, and we've sort of been studying it ever since. Dr. Gary Richardson's in the audience. He participated in some of these studies at the Stanford University Summer Sleep Camp. And so we now know that sleep loss causes an increased sleep tendency at any time, but it's more important during the day, and that extra sleep can reduce this. And right now, we're actually, extra sleep, in addition to decreasing daytime sleepiness, improves performance. And there are a lot of performance measures where you have a personal best, and then if the subject or patient gets extra sleep, their personal best goes up. I think I have a little bit of information from those studies. We're now studying varsity athletes at Stanford, because somebody participated in that study first was a swimmer, and he was amazed that his personal best sprint time got better. So the cumulative process is conceptualized as sleep debt, and so all lost sleep. This isn't really true, as it turns out. There's a new wrinkle, but you don't like to confuse undergraduate students with little wrinkles. You want it to be simple and clear that lost sleep creates a sleep debt, period. Sleep debt can only be reduced by getting extra sleep. Sleep debt can accumulate rapidly or very gradually. Most people have a sizable sleep debt. Now, The point of this all is that these are the important facts that every man, woman, and child in America should know, and 90% at least do not know, do not have any idea. And that is, in my opinion, what should be a major, major mission of this field in the future, to somehow penetrate the mainstream educational system. And I think that having tried to get into high schools, we have 2 hours of curriculum time at the Stanford University Medical School. I mean, I've given up fighting about it, but it's kind of shocking. And most medical schools, as the recent IOM report showed, have very little also, and many have nothing. And we all know there are 2 ways for human beings to accumulate a large and dangerous sleep debt: reduced daily amounts of sleep and excessively frequent interruptions. And there are these heroic experiments where people were awakened every minute or every 5 minutes through the night, and then daytime alertness was measured in the following day. They're truly heroic. So in the real world, the most important aspect of this is what people should know, is that most people can lose sleep without, falling on the floor, but they don't realize that they have become at risk and vulnerable, and that it happens not with losing whole nights of sleep, but with a chronically reduced amount of sleep. So this is the Stanford Summer Sleep Camp, a decade of discovery, and Tom Anders, a guy at Stanford who I will never forgive, lured Mary Carskadden away to Bradley Hospital and Brown University in Rhode Island. But she was there. She was director of the sleep camp for 10 years. And just about everything that we know behaviorally about sleep tendency, the framework was developed in the Stanford sleep camp. So physiologically, sleepiness is a propensity to fall asleep. I mean, you're thinking, can you teach this to high school students? Can you teach this to college students? Of course. Now, at the present time, these are estimates, but I would say these are what I think are the prevalences. 150 million Americans have sleep disorders, so God, they shouldn't be ignorant. 30 million have obstructive sleep apnea. 27 million have restless leg syndrome. 80 million complain of insomnia. And then there are also parasomnias and many other diagnoses. The number one single illness health problem, in my opinion, in the United States is sleep-disordered breathing, obstructive sleep apnea. Probably developing to serious cardiovascular disease if untreated for years. So also, if you have kids, go into their bedroom and listen to them breathe. I do that with my grandchildren all the time. They don't. So far, no one is awakened while I'm peering at their eyes. But they breathe effortlessly and noiselessly during sleep. If you're hearing, no child should have that. That means there's going to be a problem. And there have been several reports now of snoring children do worse in schoolwork and on tests. So that there is evidence, even if it isn't sleep apnea. Okay, this is a movie that I got from Ricardo Stews. I don't know if it's going to show or not, but maybe you should come up and describe it. But anyway, it's you want to? I mean, you deserve a Nobel Prize for this movie.
No, I don't think so. It's actually a very simple movie that we made, and what we did is we wanted to study snoring in situ, and we couldn't do that really at night when the people were sleeping, because we needed an endoscope that we would put through the nose and then have it going down from the palate down to the throat, to the pharynx. And what we did is we anesthetized the patients with propofol during the daytime, and then automatically they would start snoring just as much as they did at night. And so we were able to put the endoscope in and then go down from the nose over the palate and into the pharynx. And what we could see is that the tissue was starting to vibrate, and especially the soft palate and the uvula, this little thing that's attached to the soft palate, would vibrate against the base of the tongue. And that's what you should have seen in this movie.
Well, and also the tremendous narrowing of the throat. You could see why they had this increased effort to get the right amount of air through. And the other thing, it's great for undergraduate class because each person snores differently, and I swear to God, it would be as good as fingerprints. Some people have the low rumbling, some people have a kind of a high-pitched straining sound, and it's just amazing. It's just great. This is the best teaching thing that I have, and you should be selling it to. It was a terrific teaching tool. But I'm sorry that it's can't be shown. Anyway, obstructive sleep apnea, as I said, I think is the #1 health problem. Identification is easy. You ask her, do you snore? Oh my God, my wife hasn't slept in the same bed for 20 years. Are you tired? Oh, yeah. The testing and confirming is easy. The thing that's hard is treating. You treat with continuous positive airway pressure is a main treatment, and it's hard. Patient compliance, and to get patients to do that consistently is difficult. And one of the reasons I've learned that cardiologists are still not very involved in this field, in spite of the fact that cardiovascular disease is present, is because of this difficulty with treatment. So some people comply wonderfully and others don't. And people say you can get it up to 70% adequate compliance if you really work with patients. And I think every clinic should have a compliance person to just do that and encourage people. It's like weight loss. If you actually see people frequently and encourage them and praise them and so on, you can almost always get weight loss. They don't necessarily keep it off, but I think the same thing would be true with continuous positive airway pressure treatment. So in the early days, we had to do tracheostomy because that's all we knew. This is a patient, I don't know if I show him again, but he had the tracheostomy in 1974 or 5, and he just retired. He was a primary care physician. He just retired from medical practice last year and had, ever since the treatment, he kept his tracheostomy. And I was always wanting to take students down to his office and have him show this tracheostomy. He finally got a little tired of that. But his sleepiness was quite amazing. The reason he finally came to the sleep clinic was he was having a lot of trouble with fatigue and so on, but he fell asleep examining the chest of a nude female patient on her naked breast. He knew something was wrong. And since I think it was in 1973 that sleep episode occurred, that patients weren't suing quite the way they do now. If that happened to anyone today, they'd be in court for sure. But anyway, he was treated and had miraculous recovery from fatigue and sleepiness. I want to show some of the EKGs. These are gathered by Dr. Chris John Gilman, and I was thinking he ought to republish these figures because they're so dramatic, and cardiologists need to see these. This is a heart block episode and severe bradycardia, little run of ventricular tachycardia, two little runs, and severe bradycardia. Here's a heart block. And again, it shows also that the airway problem doesn't go away with either tracheostomy or continuous positive airway pressure, but you're holding it in abeyance. Oh yeah, this is the doctor that had the tracheostomy, still has his tracheostomy, and even though he's obese, he's normotensive. And I was going to tell her there was a patient from Pendleton, Oregon, which is fairly close to Walla Walla, Washington, and this patient was referred to the director of the sleep clinic in Walla Walla. His name is Dr. Richard Simon, by his doctor, because he thought he was in the final stages of congestive heart failure from hypertensive cardiopathy, that maybe Dick knew one last drug or had an experimental treatment. He had 4-pillow orthopnea. He could not go upstairs. His maximum walking distance was half a block. He couldn't work. He'd been out of work, and had not had sexual relations, as I recall, for almost 25 years with his wife, or anyone else for that matter. So Dick says he recognized that he had sleep apnea in like 10 seconds. He's asleep in the waiting room. He was treated and essentially made normal. I mean, it's a real miracle that he can walk any distance, he can exercise, he can go up a flight of stairs, and has renewed a sexual relationship with his wife. So that's what treatment of obstructive sleep apnea can do for people. And if the figure I read recently that 90% remain unidentified, first of all, doing research and studying these things becomes, useless. If people don't benefit from the research, then what's the point? So I think we can do so much through making the public aware of these things and what they should do about them. My rule of thumb is if someone's snoring bothers a bed partner, it should be checked out. And I'm blocking on his name, but the fellow at Mayo Clinic studied the bedmates of sleep apnea patients, and their sleep was just as disturbed as the victim with sleep apnea. I reiterate that kids and young adults should breathe quietly and effortlessly. And I'm willing to say 80 to 85% are unidentified, because the 90% figure that I read recently wasn't really well documented. And we did, with the National Commission, search through computerized databases. We'd call a clinic and say, would you search your database for this code? And we stopped at 10 million, and there were only 73 codes for obstructive sleep apnea. And this would be in 1992 and 93. And then it was very badly criticized because people said, hey, nobody codes, they don't code. So we went through, in the Stanford area, in primary care clinics, page-by-page records, and we didn't find one single diagnosis. So these are the kinds of evidence that we need to penetrate the educational system. In that same study, there were no codes for any insomnia in these three studies. The computerized databases, the one we did in the Bay Area, and then we also did this in Walla Walla, Washington. Then in 1997-98, we went through 3,000 plus patient charts in Moscow, Idaho, and found no specific diagnoses for insomnia. Often they'd be prescribing sleeping pills, and there would be no reason in the chart. And then the leading medications, and when I said, is it still the leading medication, everybody nodded, trazodone, an antidepressant. So that, well, I think I have the data then of the actual presumptive diagnoses. First of all, nobody goes to a doctor for transient insomnia, and yeah, trazodone, and the story of the plantar wart, I'll repeat. In Moscow, Idaho, we had a wonderful research associate. Her name is Deborah Nichols, and she is now managing the database for the apnea positive pressure long-term efficacy study that is going on in 5 cities. But she knew this man came in, a burly man who was a contractor, and he'd started his own business, and he was going to have a plantar wart removed. I just love this story. And when he came out after the procedure, she asked him, hey, Jim, how are things going? Because she knew he had started this business. And she said, he started to cry. And it was very startling. He said, what in the world is wrong? He said, I'm going bankrupt. And as it turned out, when he started the business, it put extra stress. He started having insomnia. The insomnia impaired his abilities to manage his business, and he got into a downward spiral and was going to have to declare bankruptcy. He never mentioned it to any physician. And I think, my God, the American public doesn't know that if you have severe insomnia, you can do something about it. Anyway, that's the story. He did lose his business, sadly. I spoke to the Spokane Society of Internal Medicine in 2002, and I said, if any of you are familiar with either or both of the following, sleep debt or clock-dependent alerting, raise your hand, and one person raised his hand. Turned out he was a sleep specialist. And there, 350 doctors. Now, a lot of times people are afraid to, okay, tell us what it is, or they don't want to have to do that. But so I repeat this case series again to kind of give you what goes on in sleep centers and what the complaints are. But a lot of people could come in with a complaint of insomnia that don't. And this is the airport in Moscow, Idaho. On my left is Dr. Cleet Kashida, and on my right is Pamela Hyde, who is our business manager. And I never saw a plane at that airport, if I remember correctly, except ours. Is there anybody here from Idaho? Did I insult anybody? Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington are about 8 miles apart, and Pullman, of course, is the home of Washington State University. But in that, every patient who walked through the door had a very detailed interview, and these were the presumptive diagnoses from the interview. 34% of males had obstructive sleep apnea, 19% of females. I mean, this is, to me, is astounding. Restless leg syndrome, 27% of males, 31% of females. That figure lowered a little bit because some people with leg cramps, it turned out, described symptoms that sounded like restless leg syndrome. And we had a specific definition of what we would call insomnia, trouble sleeping so many nights a week, 30% of males, 35% of females. But it turned out that the number of patients who complained of 1, 2, or 3 symptoms that allowed us to identify these sleep disorders was 60.1% of the entire clinic population. And how many diagnoses were there? 0. And that was in 1998. And I don't think it's much better today. So we got a grant from ResMed to actually do sleep recordings on the patients that we had assumed had sleep apnea. And we managed to get, I don't remember exactly, a pretty good sample into a laboratory. There is one in Moscow. And 100% had a sleep and breathing problem. And some of them was pretty mild, but they all had it. So it was 100% correct presumptive diagnoses. We've done a study of restless leg syndrome at Stanford. As I said, the percentage is a little lower than this because leg cramps apparently gets into it. So, evidence of inadequate progress in society today. Diagnosis and treatment of sleep disorders in clinical practice is practically 0, even in places where, there's lots of sleep clinics. I mean, even our primary care clinic at Stanford is still marginal, in my opinion. Introductory psychology textbooks cover sleep now, but they don't really get into sleep disorders in a way that would be useful. There aren't that many programs on human biology in colleges and universities, but again, they don't really effectively address sleep except at Stanford that I know about. Nothing in medical school. This was the National Commission survey. We found a total teaching back when the commission existed of 20 minutes about sleep was the average in medical school. It isn't much better today. The Institute of Medicine studied this, and their book is, I think it's Sleep and Sleep Deprivation are an Unmet Need that came out a year or so ago. Made the same recommendations, and public awareness is minimal. And these are the surveys of the Stanford students, and we got the same low percentage in 2004. I didn't do the same surveys in 2005, 2006. I'm going to do it in all my dormitory talks this fall, in the course, in the winter, which I expect at least 600 students will attend, and then in a few talks in the spring quarter, and report the results, I hope, at the APSS meeting in Baltimore. I've started, if someone is having sleep apnea on a plane or a bus, I tell them. It's like, it doesn't always work. You're hustling business. But this guy had sleep apnea, for sure. And I was going to tell him, well, he didn't have a bag, and I had a bag in the overhead. He got off the plane ahead of me, and I lost him. So I went into the bathroom, and I was standing facing the wall, as men do, and I realized he is standing right beside me. And I said, "Sir, you have a terrible problem." And he looks at me, what the hell are you talking about? You think I should have, you should be ashamed of yourself. And he walked out. So he may be dead for all I know. And this is the driver of a taxi. I was going to, of all things, a meeting hosted by the National Sleep Foundation on the North Shore of the Columbia River, and in Skamania Lodge, if anybody ever heard of that, it's a beautiful place. And the plane landed in Portland, which is about 35 miles from this lodge, and I decided to just, rather than try to find a limousine, take a taxi. So you go across the Columbia River Bridge, and on the North Shore, the highway is only 2 lanes, and we're driving along, and it was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I say if I had been taking a nap in the taxi, I would not be here, because I was shocked to hear gravel noise, and the cab is going off into the gorge, which is about 300 feet down. And I screamed and hit him and grabbed at the wheel, and we went into the oncoming lane. If there had been a truck coming, I wouldn't have been here. And so when we got to the lodge, we got out, I said, "God," I was pretty mad. I said, "Do you snore?" And he says, "My wife hasn't slept in the same room with me for 30 years. I don't know." And he had flagrant symptoms of obstructive sleep apnea. I sent him to Jerry Rich in Portland, who I'm pretty sure got treated. But it's kind of the story. It's everywhere. So when you're being driven in a limousine or taxi, keep your eye on the driver. It might just save your life. Yeah. This is a recent bus crash that I was involved as an expert witness, and makes, I think, a very important point about awareness and the need for awareness and the need for effective awareness. The bus trip was from St. Louis to Nashville. It was an all-night trip. There were about 50 passengers on the bus. The driver was clearly tired and irritable, and he stopped the bus a couple of times not at a bus stop and just got out and walked around the bus. And about 6:30 in the morning, he fell asleep, flagrantly asleep with his head on the wheel. And the bus started to drift off, as you can see, to the left. And now the passengers are doing something, screaming and yelling. And finally, the bus driver woke up, pulled the wheel to the right too hard. The bus went off the road to the right, rolled over several times. 2 people were killed. And there are a lot of headlines about this in the local papers, but it's all about how effective the helicopters were in getting the victims to hospitals. Nothing about the driver. And the point is that the passengers should have known, with the condition of this driver, that they were at very high risk for a falling asleep accident, and should have had the knowledge and certainty to do something about it. Now, doing something about it and forcing him to quit driving would be pretty inconvenient, because they have to send another driver out, etc. But you may save your life. And in addition to 2 fatalities, there were horrible injuries. And the passengers did nothing until the accident actually occurred. So I suggested to Greyhound that they should print on their tickets, you are empowered to have a drowsy driver stop driving. Do it. As far as I know, they haven't done that. But I would do it. I mean, it's just kind of funny, because it's a little embarrassing. You say to a limousine driver, I think you're falling asleep. Oh, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. I saw you in the rearview mirror. Now, I want you to stop this limousine. I want to sit in the front seat. I'm going to keep my eye on you. No, that's what I do. I don't want to die in an automobile crash. There's a slide that Tom Roth uses. I want to die peacefully in my sleep like my grandfather did, with all the other passengers yelling and screaming, or something like that. Anyway, we have to realize when we begin to address this field that there are obstacles to overcome. One is mythology. You know, there's a lot of weird beliefs about sleep. We don't have, in the public sector, a really precise language. I'm going to give you that in a moment. And there's a lot of inappropriate skepticism. You know, and it's like everybody believes that quarks exist. I just find this amazing. I have not encountered any person who said, no, I don't believe quarks exist, but they believe sleep debt doesn't exist. You know, you never saw a quark. Come on. But physics and particle physics is a very well-established discipline. Oh, here it is, yeah. The 6 quarks are up, down, top, bottom, charm, or flavor. Anyway. So I would say sleep medicine came along at the same time as the really major efforts to hold down medical cost, and that was sort of a barrier. Curriculum time, woof. And so here's the knowledge acquisition has exploded. Benefits to victims is very, very poor. And I think I would say that's true today. This is just some historical stuff. Association of Sleep Disorder Centers in 1978, 1981. So there are now about 1,000 sleep disorder centers. And these are the results from Moscow in graphic form. And we have not really studied another primary care clinic because Moscow is really isolated. You know, you wouldn't say it's contaminated by the local environment, but around Stanford, it would be very hard to eliminate that effect. So, what everyone must understand deeply and is taught essentially nowhere is about sleep debt. And we've learned in the past 2 or 3 years that if you are an active adult, you rarely get sleepy even if you're very sleep deprived, but you feel tired. Now, there's a little problem differentiating just feeling tired as not motivated, lethargic, from what people feel with strenuous athletic activity when they're not in training. But I don't think that's going to be a problem. And there are a lot of people that feel tired. They say, I feel tired all the time, and they're not, participating in any athletic programs. Need to understand that the role of the biological clock, which I haven't mentioned, is alerting the brain. So there's this period of time when that effect is the most strong, that you can't fall asleep. It is the leading cause of insomnia in college students, and they think if they go to bed at 11, they can get some extra sleep. Well, they're wide awake and they can't fall asleep. And I think it's very common to say, well, I'll never do that again. Sleep disorders are hugely commonplace. That if it's 60% of an average primary care practice, what more do we need to know? And then we are not an sleep-aware society. I told a story this morning, I think, that had an exam where you strongly agree, or strongly disagree, or disagree with a statement. And I was amazed that we made the statement that sleeping pills are addicting. And 95% of Stanford undergraduates strongly agreed with that. So that image is still there. That you should not use a sleeping pill until you've had severe insomnia for at least 30 consecutive nights. That Well, I don't know where that came from, but again, we're up at the 90% level agreeing with that. The currently marketed sleeping pills, as you may or may not know, are certainly not addicting, and they are certainly effective. But what I like to remind people is if you have severe insomnia for any reason, that you're building up a very large sleep debt. And I like to tell a story of someone I know who was vacationing at a New Jersey beach with her sister, her sister's husband, and her own husband, and 5 children among them, 5 young children. And while they were there, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And her husband was in the Air Force Reserve, and he got immediately called up and was sent to the Persian Gulf, and she didn't know where he was or what he was doing. And the brother-in-law was jogging on the beach and had a heart attack and was airlifted to Philadelphia. And she was left alone with her disappeared husband, her dying brother-in-law. Her sister went to Philadelphia with the brother-in-law. She had the 5 kids. She had terrible insomnia. She just stressed out of her mind and couldn't really handle the 5 children. But she had severe insomnia for 3 nights, went to a local physician, begged for something to help her sleep. And he said, no, sleeping pills are addicting. Try warm milk. And in desperation, she decided to drive to her mother's home, which is about 150 miles inland, or 200, with the 5 children. And going through a small town, she ran a red light and lived to tell about it. But she was broadsided by a truck. The car was demolished, and everyone in the car was injured, but not life-threatening illnesses. And that just because that damn doctor, was not well informed. And how many times does this happen? Stuff like this. We have no way of knowing, but I hear stories all the time. The larger your sleep debt, the more tired you will feel, the more impaired you will become, the more likely you are to become drowsy, the faster you will fall asleep, the more likely you are to fall asleep and die. Sleep death in the heart. I think everybody feels that obstructive sleep apnea is related to cardiovascular disease. And Clete Kushida has designed, this is a doctor at Stanford, a very sophisticated study with the cardiology department. Most of the measures, I don't even know what they are. So I'm sort of semi-retired in that area. But I think that identifying and treating every victim of obstructive sleep apnea will have an impact on cardiovascular disease in America, which is the #1 healthcare cost. And as I already told you, the results of Terry Young, and I think she's following a cohort of obstructive sleep apnea patients, and they are getting worse, and she's documenting the development of high blood pressure. And so I think everyone should have a vial of Rosarim, Ambien, Lunesta, or Sonata in the medicine cabinet for emergencies, because it's fire extinguisher in the house, oxygen mask on a plane, snow chains in the trunk. There are times when it is very, very appropriate and desirable to help yourself sleep. We did a study of 200 truck drivers, and Ricardo Stu's participated in that study. You did a lot of good stuff, ever since. But anyway, they would say, well, when do you get off the road? Well, sometimes I see a tree in the road. I know I must have hallucinated. Or sometimes I have this head drop with a startle. Then I get off the road. Well, that means they fell asleep. And so there have been studies of drowsy driving. Now, this is the first meeting of what is now the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Don't know if anybody would. I'm the guy with the pink shirt on your left. And 2 for the price of 1. This is the reason to teach about this, is that not only are you helping the victim of sleep apnea, but the bed partner has either never slept with the victim for 20 years in the same room, or has slept in the same room, is just as impaired by sleep interruption and sleep deprivation. It's 2 for the price of 1. And that message is just not out there now. I never hear it. And I hear people saying, well, I don't know if I want to do this mask over my nose and this hose. And, it's 2 for the price of 1. And the wives love it, or the husbands, if the wife is the victim. And I told this story about this couple this morning, and I actually got a laugh. I shouldn't say that, but these are 2 people, a married couple, both of whom were very overweight, both of whom had all the symptoms of sleep apnea, snoring, etc., and had completely lost their libido. They hadn't had sexual relations for years. So they were put on CPAP, and I got a Christmas card, actually. But when they came back, I think it was about 3 months for a follow-up visit, they had not lost weight, but they endorsed the treatment in this manner. They said, with these hoses on our noses, we may look like elephants, but we're screwing like rabbits. True story. No, I think it's a great story. A little bit off color, but... And this is a picture of Senator Mark Hatfield at a hearing in Portland, Oregon, and the National Commission had presented its report, and he held this hearing, and at the end of the hearing, he announced to the group of witnesses or patient witnesses and sleep specialists, et cetera, that the first business when I return to the Congress in January will be to create the National Center on Sleep Disorders Research, which was S104. And he did it. And then we did have to go around and get some other signatures, but that was not a problem. And so the challenge today is really education, in my opinion, that a huge reservoir, and this is the Grand Coulee Dam, by the way, this huge reservoir of sleep knowledge has accumulated, but it's held back behind a dam of pervasive ignorance and unresponsive bureaucracies. And we don't know how many preventable tragedies are occurring right this very minute. Since 9/11, I don't say blow up the dam as very often. But it is that. Blow up the dam or lower the floodgates. But that knowledge has got to be made available to the public. And it's your job, or it's really not the job of the people in this room, but it's certainly the job of people in the field of sleep medicine to foster that as much as possible. And I think the best target will be the undergraduate level, because any professor can give any class he or she wants, as long as it isn't required. It's at a level, because undergraduates have never heard of most of this before, that it's at a simple level. They can get what they need to know to save their lives, and it ought to be in every college and university in the United States. I'm so pleased that it is here at the University of Michigan, an undergraduate course, and hopefully there'll be many more in the not too distant future. I'm sort of planning to recruit as many places as I can to permit me to enter and give them the lecture images. It's 26 lectures, and the textbook, text files, whatever. And as I go across the country to Baltimore next spring, I'm sort of stopping at colleges and universities, and hopefully, and I assume that this place will be a nidus of reaching out to other colleges and universities. High school would be good because the kids are learning to drive, and that's what, if I had known when my son was learning to drive what I know now, I don't think I could have stood it. But I think high school is just harder. And we have only so much in the way of resources and time, but it really must happen. And that would be my final word. Thank you.